patiently waiting on my dreams to come true, hoping and praying one day that they do. Oh, I don't know how, and I don't know when, just patiently waiting till then.
Every once in a while, an idea grabs hold of me and won't let go. Until I can sit down and purge it from my system, it haunts me, like food poisoning. And recently, gazing at this wall of discarded Barbies gave me just such an idea. And this is the story of how it led to my first 1/6 scale human figure. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. For 2 years now, I've been populating my planet of Aegis with creatures, structures, and mechs. But with this build, I wanted to focus on a singular human character in glorious 1/6 detail. While I did start off with some Barbies, their exaggerated proportions and lack of articulation forced me to look elsewhere for a base model, though I did hang on to this green jumper. This doll was a much better choice for a base model, though the anatomical accuracy called for a tube top. The accessories the doll came with were incredible too. Just look at these amazingly sculpted hands and gorgeous articulated feet. Okay, that came out weird. I mean to say that the articulation on this model was gorgeous, from the way the legs folded all the way back, to the ball joints in her hips, and the way her spine moved like this. It was mesmerizing. After some posing, I got out the watercolor paper and began the concept. Please note, I am terrible at drawing humans. They never seem to come out right. So in an effort to correct matters, I decided to learn a bit of anatomical proportion, then carefully marked everything out. As always, this little bit of preparatory work went a long ways, and though I still struggled, especially with these legs, having a physical figure in front of me really boosted my understanding of the natural curves and flow of the human body. The end result was nowhere near perfect, but it was a lot better than any of my previous attempts. One thing I've learned in my years of dabbling in the creative arts is to not aim for perfection, but rather improvement. Identify one aspect you want to improve, and in your next project, focus on that thing alone. For me, it was getting this figure right. Did I do it flawlessly? No, but it's progress, and I was okay with that. There were so many little details and accessories that I wanted to include here. This character, named Len, plays a pivotal role in my upcoming book, and I cannot wait to share her adventures with you. After your overwhelming feedback from the last video, I'm happy to announce that I will be releasing a limited run of signed hardcover novels. These will be available for pre-order on my website as we get closer to a release date. Of course, I'll also be releasing an unlimited number of paperbacks and unsigned hardcovers, along with an ebook, and yes, I'll be narrating the audiobook version myself. With my concept for Len locked down, it was time to bring her to life. Len comes from a tough and troubled background. She's endured abandonment, betrayal, and the worst schemes of two empires. Those experiences have hardened her, and I wanted that reflected in her sharp, chiseled features and a stoic, steely expression. Rebecca Ferguson was the perfect reference model for this character, and if this series ever gets adapted to film, she'd be my first casting choice for Len. This was my very first time doing any serious sculpting in Blender, and I was pretty overwhelmed by how complicated it seemed. But after getting acquainted with the tools and slowly chipping away at the head, feature by feature, wrinkle by wrinkle, I ended up with something I was happy with, even if it ended up looking a lot more like Millie Bobby Brown than the source model. It also took a couple of attempts to get the sizing right here, and further alterations were needed to fit it onto the neck peg. But once I did, I felt a little chill run up my spine. The character in my head was coming to life before my eyes. Long before this project began, I had been shopping around online for dolls' clothes, partly for wardrobe inspiration, but partly because I really didn't relish the thought of sewing my own clothes. But by the time the previous JunkBot challenge was wrapping up and those items I'd ordered still hadn't even shipped, I was running out of options. I finally canceled the order, fought for a refund, and rolled up my sleeves. It was time to bust out the sewing machine. The problem is, I'm a miserable tailor. Hunched over my workbench, I felt like a caveman trying to understand thermodynamics. Seriously, there was a lot of unusable footage of me lumbering around the room trying to make heads or tails of bobbins and stitch settings and needles. But eventually I sort of figured it out and was off to an okay start with this stitch here, which would be the mouth of one sock. After wrapping this around the doll's leg, then pinning it to get the shape of the leg, I penciled in a line as a guide, then ran that through the sewing machine. Of course, I should have had a bend in the template, like a real sock. But in spite of that obvious flaw, after turning the socks inside out and slipping them on, they were pretty okay. Encouraged by my modest success, I was totally overconfident and ready to dive in headfirst and have my sewing aspirations completely devastated. How hard could a shirt be? I thought. I mean, it was just a matter of taking some general measurements, then drawing a roughly shirt-shaped template on the fabric with obvious width allowances for the generous endowment, then just cut a couple of those templates out, sew the edges, and turn it inside out. Easy, right? Well, that's what I thought, but no. It ended up looking less like a sci-fi engineer's shirt and more like Peter Pan's tunic. This was not going to work. So I decided to try a totally new approach by sketching out a template on paper first, making the garment longer, adding a lower neckline, and making the sleeves separate pieces. I was much more meticulous in tracing this new template onto the fabric and in cutting the fabric out. I also tried using a bit of white glue to help keep the hemmed edges in place, a technique I would end up using again and again. Was this painstaking? Yes. Was it a lot harder than I imagined? Yep. Do I have a newfound respect for anyone who can sew or alter a garment? Totally. But in the end, after all that arduous work, and probably a good 3 hours bent over the sewing machine, I turned my creation inside out and slipped it onto the figure, and it worked. On to the overalls. Now, one very important thing in scale modeling is material scaling. That means keeping in mind the texture and rigidity and choosing the proper material. In the case of her thick overalls, for instance, I couldn't use thick denim or anything too coarse. It simply wouldn't fall realistically on such a small figure. These thin khaki shorts did the trick though, and I was pleased with how much easier they were to work with than the t-shirt cotton. After pinning two of the sides together, I laid my first stitch line and was happy with the results. I did the other half, then added the hem to the cuffs. I then added some of the fun but totally non-functioning garment details like these back pockets. I totally cheated here, simply folding over the edges of the fabric, stitching them, and then gorilla gluing them to the overalls. This was more or less repeated for the cargo pockets on the front, with the addition of this little band of fabric for added detail. Something really interesting that I discovered while working on this project was that, while there was a huge learning curve in working with fabric and thread, the basic methodology of kit bashing and scratch building applied here as well. Knowing what to include and what to omit to create the illusion of detail and functionality is key. The real challenge here was in making sure the dimensions were accurate, since none of this work would be usable if the overalls didn't fit the model. In the end though, after some minor alterations, I was able to squeeze the body inside for a snug but acceptable fit. For the belt, after sewing this strip of fabric, I stole a Star Wars model part for the buckle, then used this grommet punch to make belt holes with grommets. I also repurposed these old bits for suspender snaps, and for all the other snaps, I punched some styrene circles out, painted them silver, and superglued them onto the overalls. With the clothes completed, I set them aside and got working on the tools. After the Big Bot challenge in my last video, with its strict no 3D printing policy, it was nice to jump back into Blender for some hard surface modeling. I started with a cube, beveled the ends, did some proportional editing for that nice sloping shape, then beveled these edges for a smoother look. I worked for a while on all the little details, like this hole on the end, all these wrench teeth, and the little adjustment ring. I also designed and printed this welding mask, though it was a bit too small and so required some sanding for a better fit. For all the other tools and accessories, I went back to kit bashing. As convenient as 3D printing is, it takes me a lot more work and time than just bashing, since every single detail must be carefully planned and designed. As an example, it took me about 2 hours to design the wrench, whereas all these other tools and accessories only took about 30 minutes. For this extinguisher, I ended up disemboweling one of my favorite silver pens because its cap was simply the perfect shape. I added some model bits from here and there, like this tank wheel for the top. I then used the groove maker I made in the last video to groove this epoxy putty. There was also a bit of ultra fine wire in here to maintain its shape. And once the bottom was filled in and the hose was added, I laid all the accessories and tools out on some masking tape to prepare for priming. I purposely saved the most challenging parts for last, and in this case, it was these leather boots. Finding the leather was hard enough, as it tends to be too thick to be usable at this scale. What I went with was this vinyl material, which was strong, easy to cut, and rigid enough to stitch. After cutting out the pattern for a single boot, which consisted of 4 separate pieces, I nicked some marks with an X-Acto blade, then stitched by hand. I figured this would give me more control than the sewing machine, though it was a lot more time consuming. I later wizened up and added preliminary holes with an old airbrush needle, which made the stitching a lot easier and cleaner. And really, that was the recurring theme for this entire project, a series of tiny revelations that made each subsequent step a bit smoother, a bit cleaner, a bit better. The biggest struggle by far was the awful grommet maker, which kept smashing and distorting every single grommet, to the point that I eventually just used pliers on them. The soles were also tricky, requiring me to cut out a paper sole first, then trim slots into the boot material and stretch the flaps over to glue onto the sole. I then quickly modeled up some rubber soles and glued them to the bottoms of the boots. I then laced up the boots with this super thick thread that I got for sewing a new steering wheel cover on my car, and heat shrink tubing made for some convincing lace caps. Stringing up the boots, made extra painful due to the misshapen grommets, resulted in this. Not great, but hopefully passable, because there was no way I was doing this again. To help the figure really stand out, I wanted something simple for the base, and went with this square box. After attaching the scrap block of wood, I added some pine wood backing, then began filling in details. This orange bit came from an old Nerf gun, this grating is from a model tank, and a lot of these other odds and ends are just plastic tubes, kit bits, and styrene rods. Oh, and a motorcycle wheel for this valve. For the pipes and cables running down the wall, I used my new method of heating and reforming acrylic tubes. I really like the look of this, as it allows for a convincing, flowing form. Heat shrink tubing gave it just a bit more dimension, after which I made a few more hanging wires with strings of epoxy putty. I finally threw in a laser cut floor grating, added just a few more pipes, then sanded down all of my acrylic pipes to get ready for priming. But before we get to the painting and the story, just a heads up that new merch has dropped. I've reworked my mecha assembly design from last year into this iconic black and white print, available on red and heather gray shirts. As always, these are high quality, super soft screen prints with my custom hem tags. Jump on over to gameybuilds.com while they're still on the shelves. The man who clambered aboard the transom of their freight hauler was no sailor. Of that, Len was sure. His beard was dark and patchy, his curly head of hair wobbling in the sea wind, but it was the way he stepped onto the deck from the drone craft's platform that told her everything she needed to know. The sea had a rhythm that demanded compliance, and you either danced with her or got your toes stepped on. When sailors boarded a vessel, they instinctively fell into the step of that powerful and irresistible movement. Their ankles, knees, and hips were like gyro stabilizers floating in microfluid jelly, effortlessly compensating for the bank and pitch of their watery mistress. Non-sailors, on the other hand, came aboard with stiff legs and unflinching joints, were instantly thrown off balance, and often became afflicted with vertigo and seasickness. Their new passenger, Len clearly saw, was of the latter group. He stumbled forward as his feet met the deck, the heavy pack in his arms only adding to his imbalance. Len felt the next ocean swell building beneath the soles of her boots and braced for it, while the newcomer tried hopelessly to remain perpendicular to the horizon. Predictably, the swell caught him off guard and nearly sent him over the transom railing. He dropped his pack and flung out his hands to catch himself. "You must be Mr. Karsh," Len said, reaching her hand out, less as a friendly gesture and more to keep him from toppling overboard. "Just Karsh." "First time at sea?" Len asked, hands on her hips. "No, actually. I spent the last few years on a university flotilla." One of Len's eyebrows inched upwards as if tugged by an invisible string. "Much calmer waters." "Right. You look a little old for a student," Len said, turning her back to the man. She led him through an open hatch into a dark, creaking corridor lined with snaking pipes and rust-bitten panels. "You look a little small for a sailor," Karsh said as he ducked his head, narrowly missing an overpass of ductwork. A droplet of green condensation plinked on his shoulder. "Engineer first, sailor second. This is just a holdover gig," Len said. "Besides, most captains prefer smaller engineers. The big guys can't fit in half the places repairs are needed." The woman threw a thumb over her shoulder to point to an impossibly narrow crawl space as they walked past. It was a hot nest of wires, vents, and blinking modules, and Karsh shuddered to imagine squeezing inside such a place, an idea made all the more unappealing by the hauler's constant rocking. Another swell caught him and sent him careening into the corridor wall. He grunted in pain, and Len could tell it had hurt more than he was letting on. She smirked, but didn't let him see it. "Tell me I will eventually get used to this movement." "Stop locking your knees. Anticipate the motion beneath your feet and try to go with it." Karsh gave it a try, but suspected it would be much easier without the weight of his pack. They moved deeper into the bowels of the hauler, past a throng of worker automechas. "I was told you're a biologist," Len said. "Blight research?" "The only kind of biology that matters these days," Karsh confirmed, sighing. "So, are the Empire's best minds any closer to figuring it out?" "I probably could not tell you even if I were among such minds. Alas, I am a lowly independent researcher." Len turned and smiled again, and this time it was genuine. She had no fondness in her heart for the Empire's elite class, but this man's modest nature and the fact that he wasn't complaining about the sweltering temperature and unpleasant odors of the machines thrumming around them counted for something. Maybe a lot. "This is you," she finally said, nodding to a narrow, windowless chamber with a single bunk inset into the wall. Across it, a cramped desk cubby huddled beneath an old console screen. A swiveling stool was bolted to the floor. "Thank you. And the latrine?" Len cocked an eyebrow. "Automechas don't use them, so the captain had them yanked. You can crap overboard." She savored the look of utter horror on the man's face before he finally understood she was joking and smiled. "There's a communal head at the end of this corridor. It's a skeleton crew with all the mechas on board, so you'll have it mostly to yourself, but I'd still recommend locking it." "Duly noted." "Welcome aboard," Len said, pushing off the doorway with the shoulder she'd been leaning against. Karsh watched the woman head back down the corridor, but she only made it a few steps before stopping and turning back to him. "Not that anyone asked, but if it were me, I'd stop poking and prodding at the blight and try to figure out how to live with it." "Like finding your footing on a rocking ship? Anticipate the motion and go with it." Len narrowed her eyes at the man and grinned. "See you around, Mr. Karsh."
'Cause we are the outlaws.
I truly appreciate your viewership. I've been enjoying reading your comments on my stories, and it's fun seeing everyone piece together the different narratives. Please keep your comments, likes, and shares coming, as it truly helps my channel to grow and allows me to do even more of what I love. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds. Over and out.